Hi, everyone, and welcome to our event. So welcome to this event, which is being hosted by the Grantham Institute for Climate Change and the Environment at Imperial College London. My name's Elisa Gilbert, and I'm the Director of Policy and Translation at the Grantham Institute. And it's a pleasure to welcome you all here today to hear a little bit more about sustainable power in a humanitarian setting. First of all, I'd like to introduce the panel to you. So we've got really a great selection of experts today. We have Philip Sandwell, who's a research associated with us in the Department of Physics at Imperial College. And together with Javier Baranda Alonso, they wrote a briefing paper for the Grantham Institute called The Sustainable Mini-Grid Systems in Refugee Camps. And you can access that very easily, even at the same time as you're attending this event, but also afterwards. So Phil is with us today, as well as Javier Baranda Alonso, his co-author, who's also a researcher at Imperial College with us. We also have Richard Morey, who's the CEO of Mesh Power, and he'll tell you more about what he does later on. We have Tracy Tung, who's a technical energy analyst at Practical Action, who do work on the ground in refugee camps. And Owen Graffam, who's the Assistant Director of Energy, Environment and the Resources Program at Chatham House. And so they'll each have the opportunity to speak to you today. As I'm sure many of you know, well, first of all, before I go on, we did a little poll at the beginning, which you'll be able to see on your screens. And that's kind of to help us get to know each other. In fact, I think it's even better than a substitute for what would happen if you were to all meet together in person in a room, because you wouldn't be able to immediately find out everything like this about everybody unless you managed to shake a lot of hands before we started. So actually, just so you know, you're in a room with a nice mix of people. About half of you are from an academic or research environment, but a good, at least a third of you work in the field, either in the private sector, NGOs, or international agencies interested in these issues. Not surprisingly, considering the time zone, most of you are in Europe, but it's great that we've got some participants from Africa and Asia, and a few from other. So I'm going to just turn off the poll now so that you can all see this slide. Yeah, as many of you, of course, know, climate change is an urgent issue that we're trying to tackle globally. And to do so globally, we have to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to net zero sometime between 2050 and 2100 collectively, globally. And actually, that means that we need to reduce greenhouse gases from basically every sector everywhere around the world. That's quite a challenge. But obviously, in some settings, it's more of a challenge than in others. And what Phil and Javier have done with this research paper is try to investigate what the opportunities are to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from the power that's provided in humanitarian and refugee settings, which is particularly challenging. But I think what's exciting about this research that they've done is it presents to us a real case study of the co-benefits that we can achieve by tackling greenhouse gas emissions. We can actually bring something that's actually of social benefit and also actually significant economic benefit. But doing so is not without its challenges. And hopefully some of our speakers today will definitely tell you a little bit more about the challenges, but also the opportunities of working in these quite unique settings. So what's going to happen now is each of the speakers that I introduced already on the panel is going to go through in 3 or so minutes a couple of key highlight points they wanted to share with you about delivering sustainable mini-grids in humanitarian settings. Then we're going to poll you all again, take a little bit of a break, just a couple of minutes so you can stretch in your chairs. And then we're going to come back and have a question and answer session with the panel. And all of you are welcome to submit questions as you go along, and they'll be collected and shared. And we'll be wrapping up at 5:15. I should emphasize, and it was in the chat as well, but please note that this event is being recorded. So if you, for sharing purposes afterwards. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Phil, who will be our first speaker, and he's going to tell you about some of the research he's done in this area. Over to you, Phil.
Great. Thanks, Alyssa. Seeing if I have control of the screen. Great. So hi, everyone. My name is Philip Sandwell, and together with Happy, we'll be presenting some of the results of our briefing paper. So as some background, since 2010, we at Imperial have been researching how sustainable energy technologies can help provide electricity access in developing countries. So as we look forward to the next 10 years to 2030, which is the target year for Sustainable Development Goal 7, there's been a renewed drive to get practical solutions to the people that need it and provide sustainable energy access to all. And importantly, that includes displaced people living in refugee camps, whose energy needs have been historically underserved. So we at Imperial use a process called energy system modeling to investigate how these renewable technologies can help meet sustainable development targets. So our main focus is on mini-grids, which are standalone electricity systems, usually operating far from the national grid network and meeting the needs of the community in the local area around them. So we use computer simulations, and that allows us to go into great detail about how different technologies perform. So for example, how much energy a solar panel will generate over the course of the day or over the course of the year, but also how technologies can interact together. So for example, using that solar panel to power a battery to then provide electricity throughout the evening or overnight. And then by considering the technical performance of all of these different components, we can understand how a system as a whole is going to perform. And then by simulating lots of different kinds of systems, we can see how they do, and we can select the best. So this modeling approach allows us to compare lots of different design factors. So that could be the amount of solar and storage you want to install, but also lets us kind of look at different versions of what the future might look like. So for example, what happens if we connect this new group of electricity users and provide them with electricity access for the very first time? It also lets us predict what might happen in the long term, hopefully ensuring that the kind of systems we suggest can be reliable and sustainable throughout their life cycle. So by understanding the impact of mini-grids, in particular their costs and also their greenhouse gas emissions, we can help support the practitioners who are actually implementing these systems in the field. And our approach lets us look through a huge range of different scenarios and lets us ask questions about what happens if you use different combinations of technologies to meet different kinds of user needs and under different kind of financial or other constraints that you might be limited by. But ultimately, the kind of value in this work is applying these quite theoretical considerations to real life examples and hopefully providing recommendations about the kind of systems that can be installed in the real world. So on that note, I'll pass over to Javier, who will take us through how we applied this kind of research to the case of Nyabiheke refugee camp in Rwanda.
Javier, we can't hear you.
Yeah, sorry. Thanks, Phil, and I was saying, and thanks everyone for joining today. I'll briefly guide you through some of the results of our briefing note that was inspired by this Nyabiheke case study of Nyabiheke refugee camp in Rwanda. Nyabiheke camp, founded in 2005, is hosting over 13,000 refugees in Rwanda. And there, all the institutional facilities are powered by diesel generators. Thanks to the electricity demand data provided by Practical Action, who will be here from in a moment, we were able to estimate that this diesel use translates into more than $30,000 per year of cost for humanitarian organizations to run the system, in addition of emitting more than 100 tons of greenhouse gases emissions every year. So our research has focused on quantifying and confirming that the partial or full displacement of this diesel use could lead to substantial economic and environmental savings in the long term. For instance, in this case, introducing renewable technologies such as solar PV and battery storage. For instance, over a period of 15 years, a 100% renewable system could lead to more than 80% savings in greenhouse gas emissions, in addition to 30% savings in total cost of the system compared to the diesel baseline. And a hybrid system that would only be 40% renewable could still achieve a 30% savings in emissions and a 20% savings in costs. When introducing this kind of sustainable energy systems in humanitarian settings, practitioners have the possibilities of choosing between a wide range of hybridization between diesel and renewable energies. And that can depend on the energy needs existing in the camp, the resources that they have available, and their objectives. Next slide, please. Oh, yeah. So basically, these decisions obviously involve some trade-offs and are very constrained by the limited resources of humanitarian organizations and the challenging context that humanitarian settings represent. But as researchers, we can support this decision-making by, for example, quantifying these economic and environmental benefits that renewable systems can bring, or as Sil was saying, evaluating a wide range of financing options and supporting the initial stages of the projects through system sizing, for example. We can also help take advantage of some of the opportunities that the introduction of these renewable systems bring in humanitarian settings, such as facilitating the engagement of the private sector, supporting them also through our analysis, facilitating the connection of productive users and businesses through business electricity demand modeling in the camp, or also participating in the knowledge exchange and expertise sharing in these multi-stakeholder platforms and discussions that we are having today, to basically try to build an evidence base that can support the case for sustainable energy solutions and greening and more green humanitarian operations. Thank you.
Thank you, Javier. That's really helpful, and encourage people to ask questions in the chat that may be inspired by the first two speakers. And now we're going to bring on Richard Morey, who is the CEO of Meshpower, which is a private sector operator in the same space, to hear a little bit more about how these opportunities look from his perspective. So over to you, Richard.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Sorry about that. Cool, thank you very much for the introduction. My name is Richard Morey. I'm the CEO of Meshpower, and we are a renewable energy developer in Rwanda. We've been operating here since 2014. We started off focusing on very low cost renewable energy systems for small DC microgrids. And we ultimately scaled up to over 50 villages in Rwanda, serving over 10,000 people. More recently, though, we've been focusing on alternative markets for our technology and solar in general. And more recently, this includes refugee camps. The reason we're interested in refugee camps is several-fold, really. To start with, when you're dealing with mini-grids, there's often a challenge with things like regulation and national planning and things like this. And while we waited for the finalization of certain national plans, the refugee camps offered a certain outlook for us to pursue projects in. Secondly, they actually represent, from a business point of view, they represent a very good market for mini-grids. They have a lot of the things which you look for a mini-grid installation, but they often very dense, so often very well organized, certainly Mahama is, which I'll talk about more in a minute. You actually often have a much more diverse makeup of customers than in our typical rural mini-grids. And therefore, actually, you have a greater plurality of, let's say, productive uses and opportunities there. And then finally, the camp offices currently running off diesel, and I think UNHCR spends almost $2 billion a year on diesel, represent a very, very good anchor load to actually make mini-grids viable, which is the age-old problem. Here's a little graph, a picture of some of our installations in primarily the eastern province of Rwanda. So our biggest project really in refugee camps has been with Alight, and they approached us about a year and a half ago to solarize their clinic. They were building a new maternity ward. It was currently running off a 20 kVA diesel generator, and they didn't want to just augment the diesel and offset the diesel usage, but they also wanted to spread the benefits to people in the camp and the community. So we came up with this concept of doing a mini-grid, which is using the existing, the clinic as well as the camp administration offices as an anchor load, and then expanding to the market. So we fundraised in the US, and we also partnered with Imperial College and Strathmore University to investigate this. We built 18 kVA PV system, and it's working okay, although we've had some challenges, let's say, actually finishing it because COVID happened. The lockdown happened the week we are planning to do the actual mini-grid installations. So it's not quite yet an active mini-grid, although it does have street lighting. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richard. And next up, we have Tracy Tung from Practical Action, who's going to tell us a little bit more about what things look like on the ground from an NGO perspective.
Thank you very much, Elisa, for that. As you've heard, my name is Tracy Tunge, and I work with Practical Action on the Renewable Energy for Refugees project. I'm going to quickly take you through the key things to consider before implementing a mini grid, and this is from a practitioner perspective. So the first thing is assessing current energy use, and different displacement settings and refugee camps will have different energy systems in place, and this will have different opportunities and different constraints. But key things that we need to ask is, what is the energy usage now in the camp? What is the current energy model? So who's actually using the energy from that system, who owns it, who operates it, and the supporting administrative structures that are in place. The third one is, what is the financial and environmental cost of that model? And lastly, what other models could work in this area? And one thing we learned from Rwanda is that often we want to, let's say, for example, replace diesel generator with a solar mini grid generator, and we forget to consider energy efficiency in terms of, for example, a lot of refugee camps have solar water pumping, and it's good to consider such things, and if they can be made more energy efficient before considering the implementation of the mini grid. And the assessment methodology can vary. So you should ask, what do you want to know and what do you want to use it for? So there are lighter approaches such as surveys or just counting like the liters of diesel that is being used, and more rigorous approaches like electronic metering of the network, which is what we used in Nyabiheke refugee camp, for example. And you will find more information in the report attached. And then the other thing is the business and ownership models. And these are not usually the same thing, but they correlate. You can't do one without the other. So for example, one refugee camp can work very well if a private sector developer comes, owns, operates, and maintains the mini grid system. And this can be based on a tariff business model where the organizations or refugees who use the energy pay a certain tariff to maintain that. There's places where an organization like UNHCR might just want to replace their diesel system with a mini grid system, and that can have business models such as lease to own or PPA. And this report by Moving Energy Initiative and Cube actually gave good examples of that. And sometimes you can have a hybrid of these business and ownership models. But there are variables that affect these choices. So first, who's paying the capital cost? Who's going to pay the operating costs? Then what are the existing structures, governance structures, and are they flexible? What do the country policies allow you to do? So for example, there are some countries that don't have feed-in tariff, and there are some that have. So how do you use it to your advantage? And the stakeholders involved, who are they? Are you including refugees? And if so, are they currently paying for the electricity they use? Do you want to move them from a place where they don't pay to a place where they pay certain tariffs? And how do those tariffs compare to their ability and willingness to pay? I think the last thing to consider is who the stakeholders are and what they care about. So firstly, which organizations operate, maintain, or use the current system? And what do they think about the current system? What do they think is inefficient? What changes are priority to them? So do they care more about the reduced cost of electricity of the system? Do they care about the carbon emission reduction? Do they care about the ownership and how the business model is? Do they want to change that? The next thing is the refugees. Is there opportunity to link the refugees with productive uses of energy? Also government bodies and policymakers. So are the policies in the country allow for this, especially in refugee camps? And if so, what licensing and regulation procedures do you need to follow Is it a short timeline, a 3-month timeline, or a 6-month timeline? And how does this affect the implementation of the project? And lastly, as Richard mentioned, working with the private sector. So what do they see as the barriers and opportunities to entering the refugee market? And can the business model that they use in displacement settings be adapted to refugee camps? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tracy. And then finally, we're going to move to our final speaker, which is Owen Graffam from Chatham House, to give us a bit more of a broader scale view, perhaps, of the issues. Thanks.
Thank you, Alyssa, and thank you everyone for having me. I'm amazed at the conciseness of all the presentations so far. It's very impressive. So I guess, just when I look at Javier and Phil's example, we see very high expenditure on diesel and a great opportunity for sustainable mini-grids. And I think it's important to recognize that that isn't an isolated example. Actually, everything that we know suggests that really this is very typical. So in the Ethiopian camps in which they work, there's a Spanish consortium working there called Alianza Shire, who effectively have shown that the price of electricity being paid in those camps is 15 times more than the price of 1 kilowatt hour from the Ethiopian national grid. In South Sudan, diesel costs for the camps in the north of the country are kind of between $33,000 and $42,000 per month. And when the Sud floods, which is often for many months of the year, it can go up to kind of $73,000 to $80,000 per month. That often involves planes carrying diesel into the north of the country. So it's a quite absurd situation. In Kenya, I interviewed 7 agencies in 2017 and found that they were spending about $6.7 million per year between them on diesel, largely for electricity generation. So I guess just what I'm saying really is that there are very, very high costs being incurred on diesel for electricity by UN agencies and humanitarian agencies working in displacement settings. So our estimates from a couple of years ago, which were admittedly formed from very patchy data, but suggest that there's humanitarian agency spending of about $1.2 billion per year on fossil fuels, which makes up about 5% of overall humanitarian budget. So we have a massive opportunity here to change something and do things better. And yeah, there are huge reductions possible, both on the demand side and in terms of replacing that diesel with renewable energies. I guess, yeah, just why isn't that happening already? I really hope that this is something we can get into in the discussion, but there's really all kinds of barriers. One thing that gets mentioned a lot is that countries and humanitarian agencies themselves are often unwilling to make what seem like permanent investments when populations are often claimed to be temporary. And this is something, again, that we've looked at quite a lot in Chatham House. And we found that the average age of a refugee camp is about 18 years. So it's not necessarily the case, but the perception is still there. It's also true that those working for humanitarian agencies on the ground don't necessarily have incentives or technical skills or capital to easily deploy these type of solutions. So I guess all of that needs to be part of the answer. Can I go forward one, Hannah? Sorry. Thank you. I guess that was a slightly negative picture that I started with. It isn't all bad news. There's been great progress in recent years. In the above, you can see, top left is a Renuvia GIZ mini grid in Kalabeye settlement, which is a kind of like a refugee camp in northwest Kenya. Top right is a solar power plant installation in Malakal, which is one of the camps in the kind of north of South Sudan, effectively that I was referencing just now. We've also seen really cool agreements being formed in Baidoa in Somalia, where the UN Support Office has just agreed a contract for a 10 megawatt facility. And I guess even more recently, the UNHCR just put out a pre-qualification for a tender to develop small PV solutions in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda. And all of that stuff is really in line with broader policy developments. So the UNHCR has something called the Clean Energy Challenge, where they're kind of uniting behind the ambition of providing affordable, reliable, and sustainable energy for all displaced people by 2030. And the UN's wider Greening the Blue initiative is attempting to bring kind of carbon reduction strategies across the UN. So this is something where there's a lot of movement at the moment, and there is a lot of change and a lot of cool stuff going on. And I think all of that is really exciting. There are still challenges, as Tracy alluded to in her last slide. You know, I guess foremost among them, if the UN system is moving forward with converting a lot of its electricity supply, how do we also ensure that the displaced people themselves are benefiting from this electricity? I don't think it's really been established how this will work in practice. There's a lot of experimentation going on with metering in Jordan, but it's still a tricky area. I guess, as Tracy also mentioned, it's difficult in terms of making sure that productive use of energy actually allows people to use the supply that is there. So, you know, as I'm sure all of you know, it's not just a case of build it and they will come. It's often quite a tricky, complex situation to encourage demand, particularly in low income settings. So yeah, I will stop there. We're still a very long way away from where we should be, and we need to take huge actions over the next couple of years to move in the right direction. But I guess I am hinting at a promising movement among UN agencies. I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you so much, Owen. And thank you to all of our speakers for, as you noted, Owen, being incredibly concise into time and actually ranging around an enormous number of issues about these different settings. And I can already see quite a nice range of questions coming in on the chat. We have a couple of those are quite technical questions, and then some of those broader ranging questions. So what we'd like to do is just take a couple of minutes break. And during that break, we're going to post a poll. It really is only a couple of minutes to ask you to tell us a little bit more about what you want to hear more of, so that we can guide the discussion appropriately. So please do take a look at the poll, which I think my colleague is going to post in a moment. And while you are also answering this poll question, think about any other questions you want to pop in the chat, and we'll answer them for you. So we're just going to give you a couple of minutes. Okay, great. So if you all look at your screens now, you should be able to see the results of the poll. So actually quite even. Most people have some things they want to hear about. I'm going to sort of start off by, let's talk a little bit about the specific energy needs in these displacement settings that we've been talking about. There's actually a question in the chat, which I'm gonna refer to for now. So Alvaro Laro asks, what are the key differences? And he asks of mini grids in refugee camps versus those in remote locations. But let's just take that question a bit broader for the moment. So I'd be interested to hear, maybe starting with Tracy and Richard, what are the key differences that you see in these particular humanitarian settings as compared to other rural locations where you might be recommending the same kinds of solutions? So if we go to Tracy first, and then I'll go to Richard.
Thank you very much, Elisa, for the question. I think first, although there are many similarities actually between rural and displacement settings, such as the energy they use and what they use it for. So like in Rwanda, there's a lot of similarity between what people in the host community use, such as using energy for lighting, using energy for mobile phone charging, and using energy for general lighting. And there's the other group which uses energy for productive uses, but this has not come to the camp very much as it is in rural settings. But I think key differences for me, I see, is one, that the refugee setting has a lot of governance structures that are not there in rural communities. And for example, a private sector player can easily go to a rural setting and talk to stakeholders and set up something. But in the camps, you need specific permissions for that. So a private sector player will need permissions for this, and will need a lot of stakeholder involvement, talking to UNHCR, all the people in the camp who are involved in refugee coordination. So that's one key difference. And I think that the time it takes to do that should not be underestimated. It actually takes quite significant time for that, which would not be there in rural settings. The other thing I think, so refugee settings or displacement settings can either be in an emergency or protected situation. And in an emergency situation there, it's very volatile and it's always changing. And there are things that, and even in protected situations, so some things become very key to look at, such as relocation. So refugees might relocate from one place to another. There are things like income, which become, and affordability, which are very important. They're important in a rural setting, but become increasingly important in a refugee settings. And you have to think about the models to use and how to make them work for the refugee setting. Thank you.
Thanks, Tracy. Quite a number of then really clear description there of some of the differences. So Richard, I suppose Tracy's probably mentioned some of the things you were going to mention, but perhaps you can elaborate from your perspective.
Sure. I'd just like to reiterate the point about access to the camp can be quite a big barrier. And I mean, it's for a very good reason, right? The government and UNHCR is very careful about protecting the interests of the refugees, making sure that companies don't just move into, and exploit them, for example. But it does create a lot of extra barriers when it comes to implementing a project. If every time you want to go to the camp, you need to file a request with the minister of the minister in charge of refugees. Another one would be these camps are by definition temporary. So even if the average kind of lifetime of one of these camps is over 18 years, UNHCR cannot sign contracts more than 1 year at a time. They're not able to give you a 20-year PPA for a period which makes sense to actually make a return on a commercial kind of project. So it can create a very challenging environment to actually convince investors to actually fund projects in these camps, which is actually why the Mahama project was donor funded, primarily through donors in the US, and then also through a research grant. And then another one is vandalism. So in the camps, there are a huge amount of people in a very dense space. a lot of whom are in very difficult situations. And I think there's often a case of a much lesser feeling of ownership of shared infrastructure than there would be in a village where people have grown up, where there's multiple generations. And so in our project, we've also seen this. We've had actually people, for example, we have grounding, earthing, not cable, anyway, bands, going into the ground on some of our poles, and they've actually been cut. As people would take the aluminium, we've also had stay wires cut, which it's actually dangerous because now it causes poles to lean and things like this. And we haven't had so many issues in typical villages. And I know that this has been an issue that a lot of people have found in these camps. And actually, if you go into Mahama, you'll see an abundance of solar streetlights, which are basically skeletons. They've been stripped of their batteries, stripped of their solar panels, from projects that have been done in the past. So that's another challenge of working in the camps.
Okay, great. Thank you both for those detailed observations. Do any of the other speakers want to add in anything there? Owen, no, not for the moment. Okay, so then it's really, really interesting reflections there. So it may be a link to another question someone's asked about technology, which is when you're considering these mini grids, do you compare them to the possibility of grid extension? And I guess if it maybe Hjape, you can jump in first of all, and then Phil from a modeling perspective. But then I'd be interested to hear, going back to what you've been saying, Richard, about the challenges of making sort of permanent energy investments there, how you think about this. So Hjape, if we can come to you first.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question. In this specific case of Ñabiheke, our study wasn't considering grid extension as an alternative, because that wasn't considered as very viable or likely at the moment. So basically we focused on, there's a diesel mini grid, let's say, powering the system there, and we looked at how it could be replaced by a renewable system and how many benefits it could bring. However, and Phil maybe can complement on this, this is obviously an issue that needs to be addressed when deploying mini grids, not only in rural settings but also in humanitarian settings, and what happens if the grid eventually arrives in the system with the ownership of the assets and the operation. Maybe Richard can refer to it if they have had previous experience. But yeah, in this specific case, we didn't address it, although it's a thing to be accounted for depending on the proximity of the existing grid and of the plans of the specific country or government, if they are available and they have, for example, some on-grid and off-grid areas designated, which can help to clarify some of these issues.
Okay, thanks, Javier. And then Phil, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, sure. So I'll actually leave it to Tracy, Richard, and Owen to comment more about grid connections in refugee camps in Rwanda and more specifically. But it's certainly a contentious issue because the extension of the grid, especially in supplying displaced people, does give it gives a kind of permanence to that solution. It's seen as a permanent solution, whereas other electrification methods are not. So I know in Rwanda there's a relatively well demarcated system of regions that are considered that are going to receive the grid or are not going to receive the grid on different timeframes. But well, speaking from our ivory tower in terms of our modeling frameworks, this is certainly something we can model relatively well. So not just a grid connection, but a grid connection of varying levels of reliability, which I know is the case in a lot of countries. Like a weak grid connection that can be backed up by a local mini grid can actually improve the quality of both. And certainly when considering solar and battery mini grids compared to a grid connection, the cost can vary. It can go either way. But in terms of the climate change impacts, in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions, a solar and battery mini grid is almost always the superior option in terms of the climate change impact compared to the national grid.
Okay, great. Thanks, Phil. Owen, did you want to make a comment about this bigger question about grid electrification?
I mean, I guess actually the point I wanted to make was a bit of a kind of niche point, but maybe it's a kind of political angle on grid extension. So I know of two examples now in both in Kenya and also in Rwanda. I can't remember which camp it is, but where proposed mini-grid projects have been delayed and eventually cancelled because of essentially government plans to extend grid connections, which ultimately never materialize. Or that's maybe a little bit unfair. Maybe they will eventually materialize, but certainly it's a tricky issue for mini-grid developers to know when to take seriously a kind of local or national government suggestion that they will be extending grid infrastructure. And it's, as I say, it's becoming a bit of a recurring theme in this sector. So it's something to be aware of as well.
Thanks, Owen. I think that's not niche, directly relevant to the question. So then maybe we'll go on to the mini-grid developer we have himself. Richard, tell us maybe how this plays out in your work.
Sure. I think Tracy can talk more to that specific example of a mini-grid not going ahead due to potential grid extension plans. This is a risk that exists in any installation that we do. And developing and investing in mini-grids requires a certain degree of coordination with the government and with the regulatory bodies, unless you're installing in a place that is 100 kilometers plus from any grid line and therefore will never be electrified. In Rwanda, that's not the case. It's basically a matter of time until pretty much everywhere has a main grid in Rwanda. I would say though the risk is generally lower. None of the camps, and there are 6 camps in Rwanda, none of the camps have grid electricity. Some of them have, actually most of them have grid coming right up to the camps. And some of them even have certain facilities powered by individual connections, but no camp is fully grid electrified. Then it makes sense because the grid electrification rate of the country is at below 50%, it's about 30%, 40%. And the government is not going to prioritize connecting people in the camps over connecting its own people. And politically, that doesn't look very favorable for them with their own constituents. So that's, generally speaking, there's a low risk of grid arrival in the camps than there is outside of the camps. And in Rwanda, there is this planning to demarcate areas which should be grid connected, which shouldn't be. It's not perfect, but it's we're getting there and we're getting approvals now, longer term approvals for sites, but it's taken a while to get to that point. But yes, this is a challenging risk, and honestly, it's hard to mitigate and control.
Okay, thanks. And then over to Tracy. Since Richard promised that you would tell us something juicy about the specific case.
Nothing juicy, unfortunately, but I think most of the other panelists have mentioned this. But I think and as I've mentioned before, there are so many stakeholders in the camp, and that will have different priorities, right? So as much as somebody else will care about costs, somebody else will care about carbon emissions, and you have to bring that together and also liaise with the government and what the plan is. And that's not always a very easy issue. And as Owen has said, it's even political at times. So having that balance and knowing what stakeholders, what their priorities are is very important.
Okay, great. Thank you all. So actually, then you sort of moved on to a different topic there, Tracy, which is helpful, which is that of partnerships. Obviously, it seems clear that partnerships of all different sorts are necessary to deliver the projects that you're describing. I wonder if you could all reflect upon, from your perspective, your role, your organizational role in those partnerships, and where you think we're making progress. Let's be positive about this. Where there kind of some movement and opportunities here for partnerships. So let's see, I'm going to start this time with Owen, big picture view. And then let's hear from academics about what they think they can bring to the partnerships, how that's working. And then we'll hear back again from Tracy and then Richard. So Owen, what do you see happening with partnerships in this area?
Yeah, I mean, I guess just there's more donor funding, there's more research interest, and kind of general momentum towards doing something on this issue than there has been at any time in the last kind of 5 or 6 years. So I guess my overall message is that there are more people out there to cooperate with, and there are more interested stakeholders than there have been, I think ever working on kind of humanitarian energy subjects. I guess the one thing that I might flag is that obviously there's at kind of central UN level, there's a lot of talk of leveraging the private sector and generating kind of productive partnerships with the private sector. I guess it's just worth saying that my experience from kind of working on this issue for the last 5 or so years is that this is actually a really difficult thing for the humanitarian sector to do. It's kind of against the kind of DNA of the way it is set up, and it can be very challenging to kind of exchange information and to work cooperatively for long periods of time. I guess it's my other reflection would be that private sector alone, I don't think is the solution in humanitarian settings. The settings themselves are very difficult to work in. It often needs kind of political and institutional support to get things done. I guess there's a role to play for kind of bridging partnerships, which ensure that the private sector is able to kind of work effectively and then is able to translate its results back to the humanitarian sector. So just 2 things from me there.
That's great. Thanks, Owen. And then moving over to Javier. So what did you feel like you brought? I know you had a lot of contact with a range of agencies while you were delivering your research. And what did you feel the role that academia can play in this?
Well, I think I briefly addressed it through the presentation, but maybe the kind of added value that we can bring in this multi-stakeholder like platform and partnerships is basically having the time and the tools to quantify and put numbers on some of the more like the more general assumptions that are like many times made about the systems, the fact that mini grids or renewables are better. Okay, but how better and up to what extent they can improve these conditions? They can offer environmental, economic benefits in these settings. And so especially putting numbers on those permanent assumptions, and also quantifying some, dedicating the time and having the time to evaluate, as Phil was mentioning at the beginning, a wide range of options, a wide range of scenarios that can help to all the other stakeholders, basically practitioners, private sector, that we are trying to support through our collaborations at Imperial, to take better and more informed decisions on the field, backed up a bit by that analysis. And maybe, I don't know, Phil can add a bit that on.
That's great. Phil, did you want to add a dimension to that?
Yeah, sure. I suppose just thinking about the kind of partnerships more generally, I think it's possible as a researcher to do kind of anything theoretically, but that's kind of not the point. And at Imperial we've been really lucky. So we've got some great partners on the call. We've got the Practical Action in the past, we've got Mesh Power. Like that kind of collaboration, that level of partnership is absolutely critical in doing research that tries to have an impact on the real world. And it would be impossible without that kind of engagement. So as I said, we've been very lucky with our partnerships. I know there's lots of other research institutions that also have great partnerships going on. And I think that is kind of really the foundation of any kind of academic research and how it can be useful, because otherwise it's just not realistically going to go anywhere unless, there's someone who you've kind of got a really good working relationship with, that you can have a feedback loop of saying yes, you're doing this kind of research, but you can point it in the right direction. And, it's a two-way process as well, knowing that the research you're doing is useful, and then having some back and forth with an NGO or a private sector organization to steer that research to make it as useful as possible, and get out into the real world and try and help people.
Great. Yeah, thanks Phil. And then moving on maybe to Tracy next. Tell us a little bit how you see partnerships on the ground. Hopefully you'll reciprocate how valuable you find the partnership with Phil.
I find Phil very useful. I think as others have said, the private sector is a key partnership that we look on going forward. But I also say that there is a major challenge with how mini-grids will be funded in the humanitarian setting. And you would need, at least, if you're going for a tariff model, you'd need the model to be heavily subsidized. So we are looking at maybe 70 to 90% subsidization, which means donors have a key part to play in this as well, at least for a while. And NGOs can bring the development perspective, and still humanitarian organizations like UNHCR can also coordinate it and help us understand more about the humanitarian sector and what we can do in that space. And I think the hardest partnership will be the partnership with refugees and what I talked about, productive users of energy.
Thanks, Tracy. And then back to Richard on talk about partnerships.
Well, I agree with all of the points raised so far. I don't have a huge amount to add, except I would just be reiterating what was said. Maybe just one way that things will develop, if we're talking about where the improvements and where things will be getting better, will be just getting better insight into the opportunity in these camps, into the energy demands and requirements. For example, we know how much NGOs spend on diesel, but that doesn't actually tell us that much when it comes to what is their consumption like, what is the load profile like, and things like this, both of which are extremely important in costing and designing mini-grids. So I think greater kind of availability and transparency of information and stuff going forward will be very useful, and all stakeholders have a role to play in that.
Great, thanks, Richard. I wanted to pick up on something that you said, Tracy, that we haven't talked a lot about. You brought up in your presentation, and again now, the importance of the partnerships with the people who live in these refugee camps themselves, understanding their energy use needs. And I think also this links maybe a little bit to, Richard, what you mentioned earlier about struggles with lack of ownership and what that can mean in terms of your assets as well. So I'd be interested to hear from all of you about how you see the potential to engage more with those individuals living in the camps, where you've perhaps seen some good examples so far and what you might hope to achieve in that direction. So I'm going to start with Tracy, because I think you're right there, and then I'll move to some others.
Thanks, Elisa. So I think in the last few years, when we've talked about mini-grid implementation in displacement settings, everyone thinks about community facilities or operations. And we're seeing this trend where there was a recent survey we did in 3 refugee camps in Rwanda, and more refugees said they wanted to be shown how to do income generating activities than those who wanted to be given things for free, which shows how much the sector has grown in the last, or the humanitarian energy space has grown a lot in the last few years. And I think there's a lot of potential to do that. And even when you go to the camps, you can see some micro enterprises that already exist. And for example, in Nyabiheke, there are about 9 enterprises already connected to the diesel mini-grid system. And those enterprises were actually willing to pay a tariff to a mini-grid developer who would come and build a solar mini-grid. So I think talking to those entrepreneurs and looking at what they use energy for, so what appliances do they use, how can they connect to the grid, what is their willingness and ability to pay, and what do they think about the solar mini-grid system. And just to say that that is usually not enough. There has to be supplementary programs such as business mentoring, and actually showing refugees how to use appliances and energy to generate income.
Okay, that's great. Really interesting insights there. Richard, maybe you also want to build on that. What kind of interactions have you had with the people who use your power?
Well, one of the things I remember being told when we first went to the camp and saw these kind of streetlight skeletons was that they were gutted when they stopped working. So it's important that obviously for there to be respect and value attached to this equipment, there needs to be bringing a benefit to the community. We have installations in 3 other camps in Rwanda through a different project which haven't suffered any vandalism. And there is a greater sense, I believe, of community ownership due to how the community has been engaged and how and how they kind of direct the use of energy, and therefore they have that sense of ownership. It is something that we definitely want to do in Mahama. Like I mentioned, unfortunately, our grid is essentially just a line of street lights at the moment because we've been unable to connect households due to being and businesses due to being restricted due to COVID-19. We had been wanting to do that since March, and that may explain as well why this vandalism took place. They weren't seeing the value of this distribution line. Going forward, we definitely plan to engage more with the community, and we've reached out to our NGO partners on the project to help us kind of engage the community and make sure that there is a greater sense of kind of shared ownership, let's say, and shared responsibility of the system.
Thanks, Richard. Those are really interesting further insights into what you were describing before. Phil, I know that when you were doing your modeling, you thought quite a lot about the different ways that people use energy. So maybe you could say a little bit about how your modeling takes that into account, and if there's anything particular to energy uses you include in the humanitarian.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So, well, I suppose the first thing to say is, as academic researchers, we're almost always one step removed from displaced people themselves. So, the kind of information we get is always, reliant on our partners who interact directly with displaced people. And I suppose another thing is when we're, we can do these kind of computer models, and we can stare at a lot of ones and zeros in a computer, but we need to remain mindful that at the other end of those ones and zeros are real human needs that are often not very well captured by ones and zeros. So we have a few ways of trying to capture this, try and make sure we remember people on the other end of this. So over the years, we've kind of developed a lot of different load profiles, like Richard mentioned. So essentially the energy use throughout the day or throughout the year of different energy needs. So for example, lighting or phone charging, or it could be for businesses like tailors or agricultural processing, or we have lots of different options. And essentially trying to do what is essentially a technical model, like a model of technology, but trying to project that in a way that is actually more about the needs of users. So because often people don't really care about electricity, they care about having light at night, or they care about charging their phone, and the number of kilowatt hours that takes is a bit of an abstract process, but I know if my light's going to work or not. That's the thing I really care about. So that's how we try and frame energy needs in our modeling framework.
Okay, yeah, great, thanks, that's helpful, Phil. Javier, did you want to add anything to that?
Not really, nothing to add to that.
Okay, that's fine.
Perfectly filled.
Oh, and maybe you wanted to give us your perspective on how to better engage with actually people in the humanitarian settings.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably Tracy and Richard have more experience of this than me as well. I think the thing that maybe I would highlight again from my experience over the last couple of years is just the importance of the assessment work that needs to go in the early stages of planning, and trying to understand people's needs and priorities is, I think, it's laborious, it's time consuming, it really in all of our cases it's given us results that are incredibly difficult to analyze and actually produce sensible decisions on the back of, but it's a necessary evil. It's a necessary process to go through to actually understand the people you are working with, and to understand the different priorities and ways that they use energy. So I guess I would just flag the importance of those initial assessments in trying to determine what type of interventions you're going to come up with.
Great, thanks, Owen. I saw some nodding heads, so other people on the panel were agreeing with you. You can be assured of that. So there's quite a few questions in the chat that all relate to financial and business models. And I know this has come up a few different times. I've heard a few different mentions of the fact that you actually need to rely quite heavily on donor funding in these settings, that the time frame or the lack of certainty of the length of time that these camps might be in existence is a problem, that sometimes there's obviously political dimensions to how you can source funding. So what kind of interesting, innovative business models, or what are the most promising business models that you see? What's working and what's not working? I'm going to start with Richard, since you're hopefully representing some of the stuff that's working, first of all.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, there's great scope for innovation here from a business model and product point of view. One is, to help de-risk the installation, make sure it is transportable, right? You've seen these containerized solutions where people will say that they were able to relocate them at a minimal fee. So if the camp does get closed down, then you're able to relocate your investment and it's not a write-off. More recently, there's been an interesting initiative or an investigation of setting up a kind of a guarantee facility to help insure against the risk of the camp closing. And there'll be a donor and some social investors who would put money into this fund, and it would help pay out compensation to a developer who, let's say, had to dismantle after a few years because the camp closed down, just to help de-risk that particular worry. And that is actually very promising. Another is anything that can reduce the capital costs and therefore reduce the payback period will also help. We've spoken about that these grids are generally these camps are there for about 18 years on average. So you can take a calculated risk, and if you don't need 20 years to make a payback on your investment, if you only need 3 or 5 years, then that's a risk that more investors, certainly socially minded investors, would be willing to take. So things that help reduce capital costs, such as we provide household power through a DC microgrid, which reduces distribution costs significantly over a traditional AC grid, is a possibility. But yeah, there are quite a few different ways of approaching this problem. I don't think it's solved yet, but we're getting closer.
Okay, so really some good positive vibes there, some interesting innovative ideas. Tracy, you're nodding your head enthusiastically. So what might you add to some of the things that Richard said?
I think what I might add, and I think Richard maybe are using that in some of their work, but one thing that has worked in refugee or it might work in displacement settings is you might design a system and include everyone and be very ambitious and say, we'll need 200 kilowatts of a solar hybrid system. But actually connecting people to it will take a very long time. So what you can do is take an anchor load. It might be water pumping, it might be a health center. So powering that first with a modular system and then increasing it as the needs come in, and as you figure out how the tariffs will work and how the business models will work, productive users of energy. And I've seen that works quite better than just building a very big mini grid system that is supposed to be used by everyone.
Okay, great. Really interesting suggestion there. When I saw that you posted something in the chat in support of Richard's comments there, did you want to add something about what you've seen happening with business models?
I think it's just building exactly on what Richard was saying. There's discussion of exactly what UN organizations need in order to de-risk these type of investments, and the kind of current working plan is towards a short-term liquidity facility and then a guarantee mechanism that takes over after that. I'm really not the person to be discussing the finer details of that, but I think the very fact that those discussions are there is I think an encouraging step for the system.
Great, thanks, Owen. I think you put it very succinctly, so no one will take you up on the finer points of that. So then maybe moving over to you, Phil. So if we're thinking about these different business models, to what extent is that something you can then feed back into your analysis and then share with people on the ground to help with their decision making?
Sure. So Javi, I'm going to leave it to you to discuss some of the actual financial models that you have modeled. But something I will say is that it doesn't always have to be like an everything or nothing approach. So a great advantage of these renewable technologies is that they can be modular. You can increase your renewable system size incrementally over time. So to speak broadly, when you are designing a system of various levels of renewables versus diesel, the more renewables that you use to push out as much diesel as you can, it becomes diminishing returns. And actually your benefits for the first 10 kilowatts of solar are, you get a lot more bang for your buck for the first 10 than the last. So it can be that, if you were to install incrementally over time, you can still get some benefits incrementally and try and work your way up. I think there's still more work that needs to be done in terms of convincing donors that that's a good methodology to use, because well, it would be a disservice to say that they're interested in big and exciting projects. Like, of course, they're also interested in kind of smaller and more impactful ones too. But you know, there's a difference in terms of having a one-off investment from a donor and trying to keep them renewing their investment over several years, which actually might be a more cost-effective strategy.
Okay, great. Thanks, Phil. And then, yeah, Javier, Phil basically told you that you're going to have to take the question on financial models. So go ahead.
Yes, but before that, I'd like to take on a point that Richard mentioned. That is basically, well, we know that mini grids are quite capital-intensive systems, and they generally need to be subsidized. So therefore, anything that basically reduces that capital expenditure, that upfront investment, is positive for the system, no? And from the point of view, also a bit related to what Tracy was saying about anchor loads, from the point of view of the electricity demand that you have in the camp, no? If you, for example, try to connect or prioritize or like the loads that happen like during the center of the day, where your solar panels are generating electricity, you might also save on the need of installing additional storage capacity, which is also quite expensive and increase the costs of the system, no? And therefore having a more cost-efficient system and being able to like feel like or cover more of your energy demand through renewables. And that can also both apply to for example, the anchor loads, or how these facilities are operating. If that loads are somehow flexible, shifting them towards the day can help to reduce the cost of the system. And also another potential point that Richard was referring at the beginning is that there's often quite an active economic activity found in these camps. No, a lot of businesses, a lot of enterprises operating in these camps, quite concentrated in some markets, and those are activities that are generally businesses that generally consume energy during the day. In contrast, for example, with a household that might use most of the electricity for lighting or TV during the evening. So trying to prioritize and connect some of these productive users and activities that you might have in the camp, obviously ensuring that you are like charging a fair tariff for the service, and it can also be another possibility, no, in terms of trying to reduce the storage needs of your system, and therefore the costs.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Javier, for drawing that to our attention as well, thinking about it a little bit differently. That's really helpful. Okay, so we're nearing the end of our time. So before we finish off, I've got to challenge each of the panelists to give a very quick answer to question of your wish for 2021. What would you like to happen next year? One thing only per person to help deliver more sustainable energy in humanitarian settings. So I'm going to pause just for a moment before I call upon one of you so that you can think about your New Year's wish. And then let's see, I'm going to go to Owen first. Sorry, Owen first.
No, it's fine. I've got one.
Okay.
So my big wish for 2021 is to see the big UN agencies set targets for diesel phase out for electricity generation. I think that alone would be, yeah, they have some broad policies in place, but that type of target would be both in line with the UN's mission, and theoretically it is carbon neutral already, but that's just relying on offsetting. So yeah, I think it's the right time to do it, and I think it has the means to do that now as well.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Owen. Clear ask. Phil, what's your 2021 wish?
I guess my wish for 2021, I'd like to see more practical examples of how these systems can perform in the real world. I think there's a few very good examples that we have at the moment, but it's kind of always the same few. So I'd like to see those kind of catalyze others, and I'd like to see them being replicated, you know, different countries and different camps. And thinking selfishly, if some research has gone behind them to help try and inform that would be great too. But yeah, I'd like to see some replication. That would be great.
Okay, brilliant. Great. Thanks, Phil. Richard, what's your wish for 2021?
I'm gonna stay quite small with my wish, in that I just wish we can get access to the Mahama refugee camp in the new year.
Good. Nice to be focused. Tracy, what's your wish for 2021?
I think my wish should just be for better coordination at the camp level, and that people like things are able to move from one point to another, and we are able to build systems in the camp. That's my wish.
Brilliant, great. And then finally, Javier.
Great. I think it's also being brought up, but I mean, there's a clear also lack of financing and also some missing gaps in the availability of the system. So maybe, as we were commenting, seeing some of the social investors or the investment platforms taking the risk and seeing humanitarian settings more as an opportunity than as a challenge will help to scale up and accelerate the progress in the solutions.
Brilliant, great, Javier, very, very clear. Okay, well, with that, I'm afraid we've come to the end of our time. So I'd like to first of all thank our audience for joining us and for staying with us the whole distance. I think that's an advantage or disadvantage of Zoom, is you can tell the moment at which somebody leaves. And you can tell whether you've got it wrong. But most people stayed with us, which is great. So thank you for that. And thank you very much to all of our speakers. So to Phil, Javier, Owen, Tracy, and Richard, you've really made some really, really interesting contributions to a great discussion. And thank you, of course, to Javier and Phil, who penned the briefing note that was the inspiration for this session. And you can access that very easily at the Grantham Institute website. So thank you again for joining us. And please do share the recordings with people that you might be interested. Thank you. Take care. Good evening.